You're watching or listening to TV Club, and for the next half an hour, 45 minutes, we are going to be talking about Stranger Things, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
And I'm Simon.
So is it Stranger Things or is it Stranger Things?
Stranger Things.
Yeah, surely the emphasis should be on stranger, shouldn't it? Because the obvious way to say it when you just look at the two words is Stranger Things, right? With the emphasis on things. But given the content of the series, it's got to be Stranger Things, hasn't it?
Yeah, the lamp I've got lighting me is burning my balls, so I'm just going to put it on the table. It's actually starting to get a bit warm. That's one for all the listeners.
Well, that's what happens when you put a blooming hot lamp between your knees, right?
Yeah.
Oh dear. I'm glad there's no smell-o-vision.
What was the question? Sorry, I was distracted by the feeling of my testicles slowly shriveling up in the heat.
I asked if you thought it was Stranger Things or Stranger Things.
Oh.
Because it should be really Stranger Things, shouldn't it? Is what my little argument was about, I guess.
Okay.
Before we talk about whether we liked it, I'm going to find out when you first saw it, and then I think we should just have a couple of minutes just on the Netflix model, because with Series 4, there seems to be an indication that they're going to start breaking the next Netflix model of bunging everything all out in one go, right? Because they bunged out in two goes. So I want to ask you a bit about that. But first of all, I want to find out when you saw it. So Simon, did you watch these as they came out?
Yes, from the first season onwards.
All right. Okay, that's fair enough. How about you, Matt?
Yeah, from the first season onwards.
Right. Okay. So I hadn't seen any of them. Series 4 dropped, or season 4, I guess, because it's an American thing. Season 4 dropped the sort of last 2 episodes, because they dropped 7 then 2, didn't they? And I thought, I hadn't avoided it. It hadn't been that I hadn't wanted to see it. It's just that I hadn't got around to it. And finally, it seemed that I ought to, so I just did. So I sat down and watched the whole thing back to back across about 3 weeks, I think. I think I did it in less than a month. So I've caught up with the whole thing, and then I thought, obviously, we should do the podcast, because we probably should have done the podcast already anyway, and we hadn't yet, so clearly we ought to. Matt, going back a couple of years, your opinion on the Netflix model of dropping everything at once, was that you seem to think that that was the model for the future? Since Disney Plus have happened, and since COVID and all the lockdowns, things have started to swing back in the other direction a little bit, maybe. So I want to ask you, because my thought is that, and I'll talk about this a bit more in a minute, my thought is probably that sticking everything out all in one go is a bit of a hiding to nothing, because you lose on sustained publicity. But how do you feel about it now that sort of things have moved on somewhat from when you originally had the thought?
I mean, I don't buy that the way they released season 4 as a sign of changing things, just a sign that they overwrote season 4 and wanted to break it up a little bit. So it is basically 2 seasons, one after the other. I don't think this is a sign that they're going to shift to a weekly release or they'll do this necessarily again. I think they're still going for this kind of en masse release at once, and I still quite like the en masse release. I don't think it loses publicity. I think you get this kind of rolling publicity of people like catching up with it. So you get this sort of spike of publicity, which you got with season 4 as well. I mean, season 4 had the same publicity as the other ones, but in much the same way. So Kate Bush became a big thing for quite a few months.
Well, for about 2 weeks, I thought.
I think it was rolling along for a month or so. I mean, she ended up in the charts, didn't she? And that was for quite a long time. So I don't know. I'm fine either way, to be honest. I get a bit frustrated. I think that Disney Plus, the Marvel series on Disney Plus, they're doing so many of them that you end up kind of losing your way almost with the kind of trickling release.
I think the thing is, though, with Disney Plus is that if you like Marvel, you've basically got new Marvel product pretty much all year round. and you never go more than a month without some new Marvel product. Ditto Star Wars. If you like Star Wars, there's basically new Star Wars product, never more than a few weeks away. This is what Stephen Moffat talked about with Doctor Who back in 2011, remember?
But I don't always buy this, but I think having new Star Wars material every 2 months or so, I'm starting to get bored of Star Wars material. Having it once a year, you know, for 6 or 7 or 8 weeks, I find that quite exciting. But when they're sort of churning it out, I'm less excited for the next Marvel series than I was back when WandaVision finished, I think.
It's kind of a slightly different case, though, isn't it? Because it's when we're talking about Netflix, we're not talking about Stranger Things being all year round. We're talking about one dollop of Stranger Things, and then a little dollop of something else, and then a dollop of something else further on. So the sort of model that you're talking about is slightly different. The weekly release schedule, though, is definitely designed to make sure that there's always something to dip into if you want to. And I think the idea is as well, and it must be getting that way now, the same as we had with Doctor Who in the 90s, where you didn't have to do the audios and the books and the videos of the TV series. You could dip in and out of what you wanted. Like with Big Finish, where they've got so many rangers, you can dip in and out with the rangers that you like. I think the idea with Star Wars and Marvel is starting to be, well, you don't have to watch this series if you're more interested in that one. It has to be that, doesn't it?
And I suspect as the kids age out of Stranger Things, they'll slip into franchise mode and start having spin-offs of Stranger Things and looking at this bit of the mythology and that bit of the mythology. They'll expand it out, I think.
It's already talking, isn't it? Already talking for spin-off, so.
Yeah.
Is there really? Right. Yeah. Well, we'd better get in and talk about that. Simon, have you got anything to add about the model, though?
Only that I think the releasing it by initially as a weekly series is a winner-winner situation. I really think that allows the fans to propagate, you know, naturally promoting the series, and equally once it's out there, it's out there like any other streaming service that you can see the whole series as and when you want to. So I enjoy, for me personally, I enjoy the weekly episode because of my lifestyle, it's far easier for me to just drop in and grab an episode once a week than it is to binge. And it's also quite irritating to hear other people who said, "Oh, I've watched it to the end in one sitting," and you have to say, "Please be quiet and don't tell me the end because I'm enjoying it an episode at a time." So I kind of feel that that's the better model, because initially when they started doing that, when they shut the whole thing out, it's a bit like when I got to the age of 13 and I was allowed to go into town at school to have my lunch, and my friend bought a whole Victoria sponge and ate it for lunch. But given time, all you want is a slice every now and again, you know, and you become more measured. But that initial thing of suddenly being able to, like, you know, drink a whole pint of milk because you've bought it from a shop yourself.
Also, we had the thing with COVID where all of a sudden subscriptions went through the roof, and now, because sort of the lockdowns have come to an end by and large, all of a sudden subscriptions are now going through the floor, because all those extra people who subscribed during the lockdowns were never going to stay subscribed, and that acceleration in subscriptions was never going to remain an acceleration. So I think companies like Netflix probably over projected what their numbers were going to be, and now things are coming back, because I think the issue with Netflix is that it's not a subscription service, it's a rolling rental service. You don't subscribe to the service. If you subscribe to a service, generally speaking, there will be certain terms and conditions, like you subscribe for 6 months, after which whatever, and you sort of renew your contract with them. With Netflix, you can go in and out as much as you like, and what you do is you rent Netflix for a month, and then unless you say otherwise, they roll the rental on. But at any point you could stop the rental and re-rent. And I think the trouble with dropping Stranger Things all in one go is you could get people who just, you know, once every June rent Netflix for a month, binge the whole of Stranger Things, catch up with a few other things they might have missed in the meantime. You know, whatever month the thing that they most want to see drops, you just take out Netflix for a month, and then forget it for 11. And that's the trouble with the Netflix model, is as we go into a time of sort of global financial crisis, people are going to be much more careful about where they spend their money. And Netflix is one of the things where it's much easier to drop it for 11 months of the year and just have it for one. So I think that could be a problem for them going forwards. Let's talk about, oh, did you want to add something else, Matt? Sorry.
No, only that I think there is a difference between something like the X-Files, which is broadly speaking a story per week, and that being released every week, and something that's novelistic like Stranger Things, that you have fewer people, I think, saying, God, what happened in that episode of Stranger Things, because it's more of a kind of an overall 3-episode thing. People say, remember what happened in that episode of the X-Files. Each episode of the X-Files is a self-contained, most of the episodes are self-contained, and something really exciting or shocking happens. And it's less so with Stranger Things. I think Stranger Things being released all at once, it's an entire series, is one episode. So I think there is a difference.
You've just kind of preempted my side of this conversation about the series, because I'm going to be talking by and large quite a bit about what you've just said in terms of how much I appreciated the programme. So let's go around the table and say whether we liked it or not. So Matt, seeing as I'm with you, do you like Stranger Things?
Yeah, I'm still watching it on season 4. I'd imagine by season 7 I'll have lost interest, because I would have felt that they'd probably wrung as much material out of this concept as possible, and I would have lost the will to suffer the 1980s pastiches. But they've survived my attention for 4 seasons, and I haven't got tired of the performances. I haven't got tired of the little in jokes to Ghostbusters and Nightmare on Elm Street and all of these things. I'm still quite enjoying it, so it's fine. I'm not madly keen. I don't keep an eye on the calendar for the next season to drop of Stranger Things. I just discovered it has dropped, and I think, I'll watch
that. Simon, how about you?
Yeah, I think my interest has fluctuated to an extent, but I've always really enjoyed it. I do think there are stronger seasons than others, but I love the characters. I love the actors. I'm not actually that aware of a lot of the 80s references, weirdly, because there's a lot of that stuff I didn't listen to. I was focused on other 80s stuff, and I love my 80s references. But yeah, I think it's of a standard, and for that, I think it should be applauded, really, because and my middle daughter is now big into it, in a big way, really. Not obsessive, but very fanatical about it, and absolutely loves it. So her walls are covered with posters. She's got a poster for each season. So, yes,
it's kind of just on the edge of being appropriate for children. So they've taken quite nasty horror and just made it appropriate for children. They've kept it just about on that side of the watershed line.
But what they've done is,
and that's quite a skill.
What they've done is they've taken the 80s idea and gone for a PG audience.
Yeah.
But this being 2022, whenever it was it started, 2017, whatever it was when it started, that means something entirely different now to what it did then. And what they're really going for is a sort of PG-12 audience. But yeah, there's no F-bombs.
No.
Or I think Hopper says that word once at the start of series 4, I think, but other than that, there's no F-bombs. So they've been very careful about that. It's a bit bloody sometimes, but generally speaking, it's more implied horror than actual on-screen horror. You've got a monster that seems to me to have been designed deliberately so that when it's eating somebody's head, the head is entirely enveloped in its mouth, so you can't actually see anything gratuitous going on. Do you know what I mean? So there's no disguising what it's doing, but you can't actually see the physical sort of end result of what's happening. Now, as for myself, whether I enjoy it, I sat through all 4 series in 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks, whatever it was. So I didn't struggle with it, but I have to say I've watched the entire thing from start to finish with a slight feeling of disappointment at almost every aspect of the production. And I guess I'll talk through all of those things, because I think this kind of goes back to what Matt was saying about how long can you sustain the 80s pastiche, and by series 7 will you still be watching it for the characters? Because I don't think you're really watching it for anything more than the characters. I think the program makers, see, this is my theory, the program makers, so tell me something, have either of you two seen the Goonies?
Yes.
Right, is it the Goonies that this is most closely hewing towards?
I guess
because
so.
Yeah, I've not seen the Goonies, but I get the impression that this is somebody who is a really big fan of the Goonies, trying to sort of redo the Goonies for the 2020s, basically.
Yeah, ensemble young cast, kids
teenage.
not being believed by their adults.
And something under the ground as well in the Goonies, if I remember rightly from things I might be misremembering.
Yeah, I mean, there's elements of that. Yeah,
it's kind of, I think the use of young children and teenagers who are halfway between the adults and the children, so the children see what's actually going on, the teenagers are there to be convinced about what's actually going on, and the adults, broadly speaking, are completely clueless about what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite a Goonies thing, but it borrows from Poltergeist, E.T., the Nightmare on Elm Streets,
The Shining.
The Shining. So it's kind of it borrows so much so often that.
But in terms of those things, it tends to borrow a scene here or a character there. For instance, in the 3rd series, one of the Russians is clearly modelled on the Terminator, and he gets a scene in each episode to start behaving like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then come the end of the series, But that's not a major aspect of the series. That's just a nod that takes place throughout. But I think kind of what they've done, I got the impression, is they've taken the basic premise that you'd have in something like the Goonies, a sort of 95-minute movie from like 1986 or whatever, and said, right, let's do 9 episodes of a TV program with that. But they haven't picked a premise that expands to fill 90 minutes, 9 episodes rather than 90 minutes. So what they've expanded instead is kind of the characters. But I don't think they've expanded. I don't think the characters are strong enough. I like the actors, but I think the actors are doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And I think the characters themselves are a bit thin and archetypal. So I think the actors are bringing a lot more out of the characters than is really there to be brought out. But for me, so going back to what I said about, just see what I mean about, I enjoyed it, but at the same time, I carried this slight sort of feeling of disappointment about all the aspects because there was no plot to speak of. In the very first episode of the first season, it was like, oh, there's a parallel dimension that you sort of gain access to by means of a gateway, a sort of rip in the fabric of space and time. And it's sort of like an underworld sort of dimension from which a creature has come. A creature has escaped through this gateway, and that's how we're going to start the first episode. And where's the story going to go from there? And lo and behold, 34 episodes later, at the end of series 4, the story is still, there's a parallel dimension that's basically empty, apart from this, basically a creature that lives in there and manages to get through the gateway. And it's just been the same story for 35 episodes.
But that's not the story, is it? So the story of the first season that's the premise. So there's this parallel dimension, which is actually more Poltergeist, now I come to think of it, than Goonies. I mean,
it is.
The story of the first season is the kid's missing. How do we get the kid back? And then halfway through, what's this monster? The story of the second series is this monster's come out of the underneath and is possessing people. So it's a possession story. The third one is where does this gateway come from? Who's controlling it? And that's the Russians. And then the fourth one is more about what's happened to where 11 comes from, this research unit, how that ties into the underneath. So those are the stories that are happening. And I think it does it quite well because the premise does allow for all of these stories. This is why I think by series 7 it's going to run out of steam, because there's only so many stories, because the X-Files was the same. But for 4 or 5 seasons,
there's only one more season, isn't there? As far as I'm aware, and that's it.
Yeah, possibly. Well, yes, and then spin-offs. I think.
I have to say, with regards to the X-Files, I gave up after 2 series.
Well, it got better. I mean, I think the X-Files stayed quite good. They maintained. So the story, the arc story of the X-Files is, aliens have been here, and there's, I haven't watched it in years. Conspiracies at the highest level of government. That standard storyline, and they wring different forms of stories out of it for each episode, and they did it quite successfully for a while. After a while, it felt like they were it was a as the French say, they'd gone boating. There was like a Shaggy Dog story.
Yeah. But this is also very heavily
Stranger...
influenced by that too, isn't it?
Yeah, but with Stranger Things, I don't think it is a Shaggy Dog story yet, because it has had there's almost a different genre with each series. So series 3 was a kind of political conspiracy thing with a possession, and then series 4 is this kind of, there's a heist rescue prison break story happening, and then the government conspiracy, a very heavily X-Files, the government conspiracy in the deserts, and it comes together. So I think that's why it's maintaining my interest, because I think they are doing interesting things with the premise.
That's fair enough, but just for me, none of those things sustained 2 episodes, let alone 8 or 9. And for me, I was almost literally tearing my hair out at points, thinking, when is something going to happen? Because I still was enjoying it enough because of the actors. And so let's talk about the actors for a bit. The kids are all really good, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think when I say I was disappointed with every aspect, what I mean is there was something to do with every aspect where I thought, oh no. So in series 4, they split the kids up, and they don't come back together till the end of episode 9, when the whole thing's been resolved. And I'm like, no, the great thing about the kids was the interaction between the kids. Why would you split them up for the whole of the series? And so I still enjoyed the kids, but the sort of main two, the sort of 2 dark-haired ones, it was like they had absolutely nothing to do for the whole 9 episodes. And basically they went looking for 11, which it didn't take much to find her. Then they sort of just were ferrying her across America for a couple of episodes. Basically, the 2 kids were doing a lot of sitting in cars, chatting, and not much else. And do you know what I mean? It was a little bit frustrating from start to finish that all these things were just sort of, everything seemed to be stalled for the whole time, almost. The escape from the prison was just 5 episodes to get out, 2 episodes to get back in, 2 episodes to do something that ended up being a red herring. Oh, very frustrating. But at the same time, I enjoyed watching the actors doing it. Do you know what I mean? And Simon, I've not heard from you for a bit. So the kids, what did you think of the kids?
Oh, I love the kids. I don't think there's a weak link in amongst them, actually. So
do you think, just before you go on, do you think the kids is the thing that your daughters sort of...
I think the characters is essentially what it's about. Yeah, totally. That is the story. It's the story of their friendship, and the development of the characters, I think, is really well done. Particularly Steve, who is a complete turnaround from the part he plays in the first season, to where he ends up and is possibly heading, is quite something else for somebody.
He's the jock, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
actually, I think his story has been the one that I've liked the most, actually.
Yeah. His sorry, I can't remember the characters' names. It's rubbish, isn't it? His initial girlfriend, who ends up becoming the brother's girlfriend,
Nancy Wheeler.
Yes, Nancy Wheeler. I maintain that when they do the X-Men movie, she should be Kitty Pryde, because she just is Kitty Pryde. But other than that, I just think all the kids are great. Really, that there's not. I haven't got a bad word to say about any of them, really. But I do think that the story of the show is the story of their friendship. You care. And going back to the whole model of dumping all the episodes down, you see, I watched season 4 piecemeal. I watched an episode every now and again, as and when I could. And I think that helps a lot.
Yeah.
I think you may well be pointing out something, that you're seeing by binging and it being non-stop. I mean, there was such a big gap before season 4 for anyone who was watching it year by year. So possibly we'd had a palate cleanser in some respects. So that probably didn't do you any favors. I'm not saying you're wrong in any shape or form. You're probably picking up on stuff that's there that we don't notice.
I think that's a good point, that these Stranger Things is available for people who want to binge it. And if you binge it, then you'd expect that you want to binge it. So you're like a mad fan who's desperate to get all the stories, all the personalities. If you're not a mad fan, like JR, then forcing yourself to watch it once or twice a week, you might not notice the fact that they basically just hang out in the prison for ages and then go back and then break out again.
I mean, going back to the fact that we watch Doctor Who stories, don't we? And when we have to binge them, I may well become have some absolute hatred for some stories.
I mean,
because I'm forcing myself to watch them. But if I watch them one episode a week, I have a very different viewpoint on it.
I struggled halfway through Frontier in Space recently, and that's pretty much half of season 4 of Stranger Things.
I was going to say my issue was at the end of episode 1, I said to you guys, oh, by the way, I'm watching Stranger Things now. We ought to do a podcast on it. And I'd committed myself at that point, hadn't I? Because at the end of series 1, I was close to giving up, I have to be honest. Let's talk about the grown-ups a bit. Winona Ryder. I almost said Fiona Ryder then. I was like, what's her first name? Fiona? Winona Ryder. I've always found Winona Ryder somebody who's got a lot of screen charisma. She's a very attractive personality on screen, but I've never found her a particularly strong actor. And I think that's still true. But I think the fact that she does have such an attractive sort of screen presence gets you through. And actually, she's quite a nice character. And I enjoyed watching her. I tell you who I had the weirdest relationship with is, David Harbour, Jim Hopper. Each of the 4 series, he seems to play an entirely different character. Like in the 3rd series, he's almost like they've made him comic relief so that they can kill him off at the end. Spoilers, obviously, I'm guessing for people who are listening to this, you'll have seen Stranger Things. He doesn't actually die off, and they give that away before the end of series 3 because there's this little teaser scene at the end where they talk about the American in the prison cell, and that clearly can only be one person given where the prison cell is. But you know what I mean? In the 1st series, he's the sort of slightly knuckle-headed guy who sort of comes around. Then in the 2nd series, he has to go back to being even more knuckle-headed about this character that he's sort of harboring, given that his name's David Harbour. I suppose that's a bit of an inside joke, but the way he does it, it's like he's sort of reverted and gone back even further in character terms. And then in the 3rd series, he just becomes this ridiculous comedy character. And then in the 4th series, of course, he spends most of his time in a prison cell, barely interacting with any other of the main characters. So he plays a sort of different character again then. And I really liked him as an actor, but I was really frustrated with what they were doing with his character. And I thought the stories were fine, but I thought the way they made his character lean in different directions just felt quite
inconsistent.
Yeah, inconsistent, very much so.
I think he starts out in 2016 as not a very famous actor, as somebody brought in to so Stranger Things. And I don't know this for certain, but Stranger Things was the first time I really saw him in anything. But
he's been in quite a bit.
By now, he really is in quite a bit.
So, do you know, what's interesting is that the irony is that Stranger Things, which feeds off of nostalgia and feeds off of an era and a particular time and place, is very much a creature of that thing itself. Because it's just occurred to me that when season 1 went out, it was at the peak of nostalgia TV and retro stuff. We were, the Marvel films were on the rise, and that was very much there in the zeitgeist. And maybe now it's not quite as potent as that, so therefore it's moved on to other things. So it's almost a series which, by its very definition, isn't timeless. It won't be as potent in the future because people won't necessarily, it won't sit on its own 2 feet as far as being something fresh and something new and a twist on something old.
In the early to mid 2010s, there was a big 80s vibe, wasn't there?
Yeah,
and
totally.
that sort of cycle seems to have passed a bit now. I think Stranger Things, sort of first two series, felt like the end of that cycle. But of course, they're the first two series. And this goes back to what I say about I think they picked too small a premise. It felt like that for watching it now, it felt like that first series probably fit in a time and in a place and had enough substance that was it. It should have finished there. But because it's carried on, it feels like it's carried on beyond the premise that they thought up for it, beyond the sort of parameters that they gave it when they first created it.
I mean, I think Stranger Things was at the sort of start to the middle of the 1980s pastiche. I think that's why the season
Super 8 was the beginning of it, really.
But then you have it the next year, the year after the year after Stranger Things, and it really was the 1980s kind of pastiche, and that was the massive film.
But it too didn't do anything like the business the first one did it? I think it too kind of flopped after the first one. I could be wrong, but I think the zeitgeist had passed.
It won was 2017, so it won. The first It was the year after the first season of Stranger Things. It too, he says, looking it up, it too got sort of 473 million, so 300 million less. So It One did better than It Too. But again,
so
it
really
too
not
was
much more than
20.
half
It
the
too was
business.
2019, and I would say It Too was towards the end of the kind of 1980s. I think the 1980s pastiche was the 2010s, basically.
Yeah.
So Stranger Things was pretty much slap bang in the middle of this kind of era, with It One as the high point, I think.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. Now that we're in the 2020s, it feels like it's slightly past its sell-by date. Is what I'm saying.
I'm not a big fan of the 80s pastiche anyway. I don't like the 80s particularly. So that's not the thing about, which is ironic because Simon was saying he didn't spot a lot of the 80s pastiche things because he's a big fan of the 1980s. I'm not a big fan of the 1980s, which is why I spot every kind of horror movie reference, because that's what I was watching in the 1990s, I guess.
And I think I probably lean more towards where Matt's coming from. So okay, the other characters. I mean, I'll tell you one thing I did notice is that a lot of the actors seem to be picked because they looked a little bit like certain other people. So the older brother of the kid who goes missing in the first series, the first thing I thought when I saw him was, oh, he looks a bit like Kevin Bacon. And there were several other characters throughout, and I'm forgetting now because.
Oh, you thinking it like the Molly Ringwald lookalike in?
There's a Molly Ringwald season 4 for sure. There is, and in season 1 there were a couple of others where I thought, oh, they just look like such and such. And it was only sort of second or third time when I thought, oh no, this is a thing. They're actually casting people because they look like other people. I mean, the main, not necessarily the main kid. I don't know how you pronounce his name, but Gaten Matarazzo.
Yeah,
he very much, to me, and I could be because I've not seen the Goonies. So am I misremembering? But doesn't he look just like somebody who's in the Goonies? Or am I thinking of somebody else? But he reminded me a lot of somebody anyway. And I don't think that's an issue because all of these people can act and they all give great performances. But it definitely became a sort of slight issue when you're trying to suspend your disbelief, when people keep walking onto screen and you're just thinking, but that just looks like somebody else. Do you know what I mean? So, I mean, the sort of science fiction aspect of it, the sort of horror aspect of it, is kind of fairly loose. They've picked a premise that reminds you of something that might have worked in the 1980s. I don't think that premise works now, but I don't think that matters because obviously this is an 80s pastiche. If you were to do Parallel Dimensions now, there's no way you'd just do an empty space with maybe a monster and, you know, smoke and fog and a bit of like downy stuff floating around. You wouldn't get away with that if you were trying to do a story that's not pastiche in the 80s, because, you know, back in 1986, parallel dimension stories hadn't really been done. But throughout the 90s and the noughties, parallel dimension stories were, you know, 10 a penny. So we've seen it done now. So now to do a parallel dimension storyline, you have to try and think up something new to do with it. And sort of Everything Everywhere All at Once is a great example of thinking up something new to do with sort of parallel dimension storylines. This going back to what I was saying about how thin it was, there's really very little substance to that. Like I say, I don't think it matters because it's sort of pastiching 80s stuff. So they tried to pick a premise that reminds you of something they might have done then. Is that how it felt?
But the impression I get is the Duffers brothers are trying to make something that looks like it was made in the 1980s, but made for hundreds of millions of dollars for television. So that the title sequence, for instance, and the music could be, that was one of the exciting kind of weird things about the first series, is you're watching that title sequence and you're thinking this is like an 80s television series, but with better special effects, or special effects that kind of work, but they're not going for realism. So as you say, they're not just going for 80s pastiche, they're going for something that textually looks like it was made in the 1980s, and I think they do that pretty successfully. So yeah, casting people that look like they would have been in a 1980s film, and the script, the dialogue feels like a 1980s TV series. But it's all tied together with that kind of the graphic design and the music, I think, and that works really well. That, you know, there's a nostalgic buzz to that, but there's also a kind of a slightly abstracted appreciation of the skill of, you know, understanding how to make it feel like it was made in the 1980s without going. So I've just watched the trailer for Rob Zombie's Monsters. Have you seen this? Have you seen this trailer? And
I haven't.
And he looks like he's going for this. Looks like it's been made in the 1980s, but it looks rubbish in the trailer. It could be brilliant when it's released, but he's gone all in for that kind of 1960s sitcom performance style. It's got Sylvester McCoy in it, so there we go.
Oh yes, of course, I forgot about that.
But the trailer does look awful, and I'm wondering if that's kind of, you know, that's kind of trying to do what the Duffers brothers did, but maybe not quite successfully.
Yeah, I'm obviously, with somebody like Netflix behind you, they are going to be giving you the confidence, because you're not looking at a movie and you're not looking at a TV series that sort of stands for cancellation if it's not successful after the first couple of episodes. With Netflix, they're saying, give us the whole series, we'll put the whole series out in one go, and there's no box office. So, you know, the success of it is, you know, whether people appreciate it on social media. And let's face it, 100 people appreciating it very loudly on social media is pretty much the same as 1,000 people appreciating it slightly less quietly. So as far as Netflix are concerned, as long as it's getting a reasonable amount of traction, I don't think it stands to suffer cancellation in the same way as something a bit more risky. And so Rob Zombie's thing, I would imagine, has got more risk behind it. And when something's got more risk behind it, sometimes if it's a slightly left field idea, some people have got really strong ideas and a really strong vision for things. I get the impression with Rob Zombie that his sort of idea and his vision is kind of other people's ideas and other people's visions that he's trying to channel. And while that might also be true of the Duffer brothers here, they've got the not the ambition, the sort of confidence is the word I'm looking for. They've got the confidence of Netflix behind them, whereas if Rob Zombie hasn't, then maybe there was a bit more nervousness about what he was doing, and so maybe there's a bit less confidence about the way he's gone about doing it.
You should definitely watch this trailer. It might be a work of genius.
Well, we'll see. There are obviously the success of Stranger Things, though, means that there's a market. Despite the fact that, as we were saying, the 80 cycle seems to have run its course, the success of something like Stranger Things is going to mean there's a market for something. And so whether it's necessarily 80s pastiches or just things that are influenced by the fact that they did an 80s pastiche. So I'm not expecting there'd be a 90s cycle necessarily of things. But you know what I mean? There's definitely, if Stranger Things has been this successful, and I think the fourth series has upped the ante on how successful it's been. It seems to have jumped another stage with this series, I think.
I mean, there is a kind of a, I can't think of any other examples, but something like Joker did a similar thing, of kind of pretending to have been. It pretends to be an artifact of the 1970s, not just telling a story set in the 1970s, but it kind of riffed on all of these Scorsese 1970s films, and it opens with a 1970s studio logo, and so maybe there is something in the air that now there's now.
Well, to be fair, the Batman sort of does, yeah.
Now special effects are so good and so realistic. The only place you can go other than the future is to produce authentic feeling retro product. But you're going to be trying to make the best 60s. Maybe this is what the next Bond film is going to be, the best 60s spy thriller ever made, completely retrospective. That's got to be a kind of a drive for some filmmakers, is I want to make the best 1940s film noir that's ever been seen, but with $300 million budget.
Well, and of course we've had lots of examples throughout the years of that sort of thing, from stuff like Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid to Mank, and to sort of colour noir cycle of the 1980s itself. So there's always been an inkling to do that. I guess, yeah, now you're talking about filmmaking techniques and the sort of budgets that come with it. And places, like I say, like Netflix, where they'll give you the confidence to just go off. See, one of the things about Netflix is, would The Irishman have ever got made without Netflix? Probably not, because, the budget just for the special effects on that would have put most studios off, because a Scorsese movie was never going to make its budget back at the box office.
I mean,
if its budget was 300 million.
Even Rogue One had a touch of this, didn't it? Rogue One quite often felt like it was a George Lucas 1970s Star Wars movie, but with even better special effects.
Yeah,
even the new Buzz Lightyear, the conceit behind it is it's a film from 1995 that was Andy's favourite film. That's where the toy came from. But you watch the film and it's a state-of-the-art CGI production. It makes no effort to come across as a 1990s movie, which is quite refreshing, I think.
Yeah, I've not seen it, but I'm quite looking forward to. And there's a few things coming out. I'm interested to see the new sort of reinvention of Predator, which is due tomorrow as we record this.
Prey?
Yeah, it sounds. I don't know whether it's going to be any good. The reviews, I think the average on the reviews has come out at about 6 out of 10. Which might mean it's disappointing, but sometimes a 6 out of 10 means, well, some of the critics just didn't get it. So we'll see. But yeah, I think we should do Predator sort of at some point. But is there anything
That's kind of my experience with Lightyear as well, actually, to be fair. A lot of the reviews, I think, didn't quite... I don't know what they expected, to be honest. So
Yeah, exactly. So
read into that what my reaction, whatever you think.
Well, and coming back to Stranger Things, unless anybody's got anything more to say, to round out, and we won't give it a score because we're talking about all 4 series, and we usually score things where we're talking about individual things. So instead, I'm going to ask you to do something else at the end. But to round it out, I think the problem was I came to it 6 years too late, and there'd been such a lot of talk across those 6 years and such a lot of appreciation for it that it was only ever going to disappoint me, because it's
equally
not, I think.
I seem to remember it being the big series on Netflix. I think that was the point at which we started using Netflix properly.
Right,
so to see something of that standard, that quality coming on, it was kind of the wave of, it's something we'll always remember about. Do you remember when streaming TV started? And Stranger Things will be one of the things that are mooted in conversation.
But coming to it 6 years later, I've missed out on the zeitgeist of all that, haven't I?
Maybe so, yeah. But I mean, I appreciate what you're saying about a lot of the. It's not like it's a sprawling story. It's kind of like, it's not literally a tumbleweed, but it's kind of like this thing. The tendrils are going out, but they're turning in on themselves because they're expanding on something which I don't believe was designed to go on for 5 seasons initially.
Doesn't feel like it.
So everything is doing that George Lucas thing of trying to explain itself. So it kind of turns in on itself, which may well limit.
Series 4, you get that scene with 11 where it's looked like she's murdered all the other kids, and that just comes entirely. I mean, maybe if you were watching it a series every other year or whatever, but watching it back to back, that just came so far out of nowhere. I was like, what am I meant to take from this? Am I supposed to think that she has killed these people? or am I supposed to think, well, how can this? And so it didn't even seem to. It seemed to take a long time for series 4 to suggest to me that I should be looking at that as a mystery of how she landed up in this situation where all these people are dead. I missed the point of that entirely.
And equally, each of these seasons are supposedly happening within at the longest period is about a year apart. Is that right? So
yeah, in fact, they're on each other's anniversaries mostly, aren't they?
Yeah. So you've got that fairly tight continuity to try and maintain across a series which is taking 2 years to make. So it's hard. I imagine it's quite hard to look in that rearview mirror and make it all add up. I don't know. People manage to do that with movies, don't they? So who knows?
Yeah, that's true. Matt, is there anything more you wanted to add?
Nope.
Okay, Matt, then I'm going to ask you how. I'm not going to ask you to score it out of 10. I'm going to ask you how strongly you would recommend this to somebody who's never seen it.
What, out of 10?
No, I'm just going to say, would you implore that somebody watches it?
I wouldn't.
Or tell them to avoid it. Or whereabouts?
I wouldn't implore. I would say if you're interested in sort of kid-friendly horror, much like Doctor Who, if you're a Doctor Who fan, I think you'd like Stranger Things, because it takes pretty grim, gruesome horror movies, and it makes it appropriate. If you're like my brother, who is a coward, a complete coward, and won't go near a horror film, he loves things like Stranger Things because he gets all the thrills of a horror film without the nightmares.
It's kind of palatable
Yeah.
grimness, really, isn't it? Simon, oh no, let me go first because my answer is going to be the sort of. I would struggle to recommend it. I would say go in with lowered expectations. I would probably say you will enjoy this, but as long as your expectations aren't too high for it, because that was my problem. I think my expectations were elevated sort of beyond where the series was going to go. Simon?
There's a fair amount of crap on these streaming services, and I think Stranger Things is up towards the upper end. So in that respect, I would recommend it because I think, but yeah, you're right. I mean, as I say, my daughter and her friends are of that age where they absolutely adore it and they can latch onto the characters and talk about it much like a soap opera. And it probably, and I think it sits in tandem with a lot of the literature they're reading as well. And you know, these are children growing up trying to find themselves and explore each other's characters and sexualities and you know, just what makes them tick. And I think this series does that, maybe on a very simple level, but I think it works. And I think it works in an episodic form. But it probably doesn't take much analysis.
Do you know what I think it's about on a level with? Now that you've said that, that's made it really clear. It's Class, the Doctor Who spin-off.
Yeah,
in
maybe
2016.
so.
Maybe that Doctor Who spin-off was just slightly ahead of its time, or just slightly out of its broadcast comfort zone. But yeah, actually, I think there's quite a few similarities between this and that, now that you come to mention it. Right, anyway, that was our conversation about Stranger Things.
Maya Hawke, how incredible is she? She's amazing. I'm really looking forward to seeing more stuff.
I saw a comment on Twitter that amazed Maya Hawke. It's as if Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman had a child.
Maybe that was an actual joke.
It was an actual joke. It wasn't a serious comment. I think he knew.
Fair enough. Yeah. Oh, I didn't know though till you said that.
Okay. Oh, well, yeah. There you go.
Oh, I tell you what. One last thing. Matthew Modine, I think, was a bit disappointing. Paul Reiser, I think, was fantastic. But I didn't really like what they did with either of those characters because they just didn't seem to know what to do with them. They seemed to be like, there should be a guy who's this guy. But then that was as far as their thinking seemed to go.
Did you like Murray, though? Murray was a revelation, I thought.
Who's Murray?
Oh, yeah. Brett Gelman?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's really good. He's the weird beardy guy that goes to Russia.
He was really good, yes.
The brother-in-law from Fleabag. See, I watched Fleabag and then I watched Stranger Things when he was in it and fully expected him to be that character again.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, he was very good. And I did like the other two actors, but I just thought that they didn't know what to do with either of them. And so they seem to sort of go good guy, bad guy on the turn of a penny, really, sometimes.
Did we both have friends like Eddie when we were at school, as in the metaler? Because most of my friends were metalers.
Yes, I was in bands with people like that, Simon.
Yeah, so was I to a degree. We never actually did any gigs, but yeah.
I know, I've been on stage with people like that. And on that note, I was JR.
I was Matt.
And I was Simon.
And we will speak again soon.